in my opinion, it makes no sense to be concerned with alchemy or the concept or even the term unless you kind of know what it means and where it's from. You have a lot of sort of new these integral study groups and self-help groups that use the word alchemy like used for everything. So it's getting to be that same old thing with America, where it's so commercial that people are wearing something that used to be sacred on a T-shirt or a hat or a bumper sticker. So, but what we're going to do first, when everybody settles in, about another minute, is I'm going to just do a little bit of soft breathing, relaxing, getting into the mood for it, and then we're going to get into a couple of deeper meditations in the later sessions. But today's really just about getting everybody in a group and going through some of this interesting material. I hope it'll be interesting for you. I'm sure it will be. It's a kind of a strand of history that doesn't get told that often, and when it does, it's usually told the wrong way. So I'm trying to make that part of this, to kind of tie that long thread, 3,000-year thread together and in a way that makes sense instead of just jumping all over the place. So we're going to do that. So it should be fun. All right, so I'll just invite everybody just to relax, let your body settle, clear your mind of everything else that what we're doing here. And we're just going to take about 2 to 3 minutes to just relax the self and become present as best we possibly can. Just take a couple of deep breaths through the nose or the mouth. Listen to the breath. Watch it with your eyes closed, going in and out, settling the muscles of your body, settling your chest, settling your mind, and just be with it. Relaxing, calming, beat by beat, slowing down, becoming at peace, at rest in its normal rhythm. If it's going a little fast like mine is, breathe a little deeper, let that air out, that static energy to release. How vivid the pictures can be, even with your eyes closed. We're going to be taking a trip today back into the deep archaic, all the way back to Aristotle. We're going to learn about how this core thread of truth lasted somehow through all sorts of trials and tribulations, being driven underground, being forgotten, and somehow remains with us. Take a good last cleansing breath, and then we'll go ahead and get started. How's everybody feeling? Good? All right, I'm going to lay this out before I share the slides with you. What we're going to be doing with this workshop is sort of 2 things, but there's a bottom line to it. The bottom line comes down to what can we get out of it that we can use in our lives, what can actually apply and make sense in our daily life, something that we can actually benefit from. And beside that, there's a whole string of very vivid and powerful imagery and archetypal ideas that go along with the philosophy. The alchemy that we're talking about is a personal alchemy, which means it's fit for any belief system, any attitude, any worldview. So it's applicable to anyone because this is an underlying thing that fits any size. So that's the beauty of alchemy as a spiritual practice, and that's the value of it that I'm going to go for. The spiritual aspect, traditionally, with the alchemists, was Hermeticism. Hermeticism, we're going to talk about it right now with these slides, is it was kind of not the antithesis to the emerging monotheistic religions of the archaic, but it was a stubborn one in a way. The idea of Hermes Trismegistus, the thrice blessed, being this almost celestial being that traveled the world and was the wisest person that ever lived, is very kind of hard to wrap your mind around the concept. But Hermes told almost all the same poignant stories from the Bible, Sermon on the Mount, Genesis, all of it. So all of those stories exist in a different form in Hermeticism, and Hermeticism also came to include the Hebrew Kabbalah, Tantric Yoga, astrology, tarot cards. All of those things that are in the modern New Age movement came from Hermeticism and the alchemists. If you ever messed with tarot cards or anything, you've seen some of these types of imagery, if not these exact ones, elsewhere, and they come from the alchemy eras. So I'm going to share the screen, and we're going to go ahead and get into some of this stuff. All right, so the question on everyone's mind when the subject comes up, what's alchemy? It's an arcane occult science of unknown origin. I don't care what anybody else tells you, that's a fact. It is of unknown origin. Like I said, there's a lot of things that happened in the Greek classical that point to the emergence of alchemy somewhere along that very long time period. Basically, alchemy was a first substance that they believed all life and it existed in life could not be in all things. And in the alchemist world, nothing was dead. And so this primum material has been rock, in the air, we're going to talk to you about that one. In the teachings, there was a theme that developed, and that was the philosopher. And the philosopher is an extremely difficult concept for most people to, but it's a little bit later on that we're going to talk about that in detail. The idea was the philosopher's stone was a material representation of prima materia that would essentially create anything. So in order to achieve this, you need, God on earth, because it already was a system. And then the other goal was the elixir. If you were to achieve an elixir of life made of prima materia, you could drink it, and theoretically, it would become part of your body, and you could never die. You could never get ill. These were two lofty goals that they had for themselves, and they believed fully that they could achieve. In the Middle Ages, a lot of alchemists, not all of them, that's a real misnomer with this, became very concerned with the idea of transmutating base metals into gold. And this was when gold was, really becoming a commodity. And so when it was fully realized how powerful such a process would be to someone, there were thousands. There were, at the time, that was experimenting with it, and the alchemists of the lineage that were so long shooting for this goal of the philosopher's stone thought gold might even be more possible. So it became sort of an obsession all over Europe during the Middle Ages, and it really came down to a bad ending with that. You ended up having many people charged with heresy, some burned at the stake. So the idea that alchemists' only concern was to transmute lesser, that's obviously not true. But there was a light to alchemy. There always was. The alchemists always believed that the spiritual self was ordinary. Even though they were smelting metals or pulverizing a stone or chemically dissolving something, their view of the world and the process was that it would only happen correctly if it was watched and actually engaged with on a spiritual level. So alchemy was not just a material art, but it was a holistic part. As the 16th century rolled around, the actual science of chemistry was emerging from alchemy. The alchemists had made some surprising discoveries that turned out to be useful, and so the science of chemistry began to emerge, and the spiritual alchemy, the Hermetic philosophy, began to fade for obvious reasons. They didn't want to be public about their spirituality for very good reason. So the material alchemy became chemistry in science. The spiritual alchemy was driven underground and relegated to occult science or secret teachings and mystery schools, and stayed that way for almost to the present day. Esoteric alchemy emerged from the spiritual philosophy of the Hermetic tradition and an eclectic pursuit of the concepts in the Kabbalah, Eastern mysticism, etc. But Hermetic philosophy has a broad appeal, especially in the area of New Age, occult studies, and the practice of magic. Almost all magical practices, I can't explain this up, almost all magical practices draw from the Hermetica, and the philosophy is outside somewhat, but still underlying with a lot of the earth religions and Eastern mysticism that you see in our modern culture. So, text up here, this book, The Hermetic Brotherhood of Luxor, the people that finally published this book were working on it for years, and I was part of that process. I'm not credited in the book, but I was funneling research to them on a constant basis because they were really concerned about getting it right and accurate. So they were asking for anything anybody had. And I want to tell you that anybody who's interested in the sort of it's a solitary practitioner style of spiritual magic. It's not a hocus pocus, spells on people type. It's a spiritual practice that you take part in, in the privacy of your own chamber, with your own surroundings and your own ideas. But this book is one of the masterpieces of modern occult literature when it comes to this stuff. Only because it's so well organized and so detailed. They found out and were able to document probably more about Egyptian mysticism in this book than the Egyptian, the nation of Egypt has in their museums and libraries. It's a very fascinating read. If anybody ever sees it, wants to get a hold of something interesting, this is one to read. Hermetic tradition is a non-theistic lineage of Gnostic mysticism attributed to the enigmatic Hermes Trismegistus, author of the Corpus Hermeticum. It's based on the philosophical principles of those teachings. The sacred text dates back to the 1st and 2nd centuries AD, but it was lost for over 1,000 years before finally being discovered in Byzantine temples and ordered to be shipped to Italy so that it could be translated. At the time, Cosimo de' Medici was essentially financing the Renaissance. So he had Plato and he had Hermes Trismegistus. And he said, he told his translators, you translate the Corpus Hermeticum, Plato can wait. So that tells you how hungry they were to sort of get back to something that they knew at that time. Try to return to what they know. And at the time, in the 1400s, that was the last sort of thing that made sense to a lot of people. So that was de' Medici's thought, and he was getting very old at the time, so he wanted to have that Corpus Hermeticum before he died. Unfortunately, he did not get the whole thing before he died. The enigma of Hermes is that Hermes exists in almost every culture and in many different forms. But the strange thing that keeps arising from the Hermes legend is that they're all accurate, seemingly, and they're all consistent with one another. In the Corpus Hermeticum, there's a couple of chapters in the beginning that are some of the main points that are made in laying out the philosophy. And that's in those chapters, you get a conversation that goes on between Hermes Trismegistus and Thoth, the Atlantean, the ibis-headed god of wisdom for the Egyptians. He carries the same enigma as Hermes. He doesn't have a definite date. Thoth is known for the emerald tablets. At one point, Alexander supposedly had the emerald tablet of Hermes, and had it on display at Heliopolis. But this was made of a material that was alchemically designed. It was finer than any marble, finer than any stone, and couldn't be destroyed by anything. So the idea that it was on display in Heliopolis during the time of Alexander, yet doesn't exist today, the only answer to that would be if somebody has it and it's hidden in someone's possession, or if it never existed at all. I tend to think it's a fabled thing, but whether or not it's a fable doesn't really matter, because the underlying truth behind all of it, it can't be denied. The Masons have the story of Hiram Abiff. Hiram Abiff was a Mason who worked in the Greek classical as an architect, and in the lore of it, he was the finest, wisest architect. He could build anything, and he was actually assassinated by apprentices of his, attempting to gain his knowledge. So in Masonic lore, Hiram Abiff is known as the first Hermes. That's what their view of it is. So if that's not something to think about, I don't know what is. And you know, if it was true, as unlikely as it is, it's quite possible that would be the Hermes Trismegistus of the other legend, because he has characteristics. So if he got old, or who knows? But it's interesting to see how these legends cross hairs here. And then you have the Greek Hermes. He's a different sort of bird of a different sort, but he still, even though he's the trickster, he's a messenger, but he's a messenger of mind. And his staff was the caduceus, which is used in medical science now as a symbol that represents coming together of the culturally, scientifically, and spiritually concerned individual in the form of a healer. Hermes was the son of Zeus, and he is, coincidentally enough, basically the patron deity of the alchemists, for obvious reasons. He's Mercury. Okay, here goes some timeline that should be pretty cool. All of these people have some relevance or significance in this story because of some aspect of what they did. Here you have a couple of pharaohs, but most importantly, Imhotep was the first. The Emerald Tablet comes into play as far back as 1364 BC. So you see, it's like we're back pretty far in time, and it's already starting to shape up like there's some things happening in the cosmic consciousness that are bringing people online about the idea of properties of the earth and properties of itself. The four elements came into play with developing this idea that there could be a communion. And so the four elements theory was his way of reconciling that. And so you have here Alexander in 332 supposedly had the Emerald Tablet at the temple in Siwa, and it was put on display at Heliopolis, supposedly. The Kitab Sir al-Asar was a translation of the Emerald Tablet that blossomed on a whole nother strand of philosophical thought in the Arab world. Moors in Spain was the first Spanish translations in 711, and I put in here Quetzalcoatl, recent things. Quetzalcoatl really was that same Hermes for the Mayans. Albertus Magnus, significant. This is, by all accounts, the most superior mind of the Middle Ages by far. He trained Thomas Aquinas. He wrote tremendous compendiums on alchemy, and when Egypt was opened up, he tore through it like nobody's business. He published Egyptian Secrets of White and Black Art for Man and Beast. It's a gigantic book, but everybody who you read, when you're trying to research Albertus Magnus, they called him Magnus. He that wasn't his name, but they called him Magnus because he had such amazing intellectual and mind strength. Nobody had the mathematics, the philosophy, the articulate way of expressing things the way he did. And when you look for him also, his main writings are extensive in alchemy. All right, so here at the end of the 1200s, you start seeing the bans happening. You got the Franciscan ban at 1272, and King Alphonse warned people not to practice alchemy. This was what I talked about in the beginning. It was very prevalent among the clergy. Now the bans get bad. All through the 1300s, you see that it started to be pushed underground. People that were openly practicing it with the full blessing of the church and state were now afraid because the threats were beginning to rise. A papal bull was issued by Pope John the 22nd. We're still going to be going through those dark ages for 2 slides here, but in the middle of that, you still had some significant things developing. Nicholas Flamel published Figures Hieroglyphiques, and this was another massive compendium, but this time it had so much art. You can really look to him for the direction of the alchemical art, because he was one of the visionaries at the very beginning to lay down that sort of coded, archetypal, hidden imagery, hidden word behind the imagery. Because at this time they started to write the words that in a way that could be interpreted any number of ways, a very ambiguous way that they tried to record what they were doing, but the details were in the art. So that's why the art's so important. But here's the 2 guys that we just talked about, Marcello Ficino and Cosimo di Medici. They're as much responsible for preserving the Hermeticum and some of these rare and gorgeous alchemical works as anyone else, and also the Renaissance. The Renaissance couldn't have really happened without them. The de Medici family and the Borgias, a few others, financed the entire Renaissance. These were scholars of a level that we don't get to see very much nowadays. They spent their entire lives trying to write things down so that other people could read them. And here you start to have some of the practice of magic. And these are significant people. I didn't want to make this a discussion on ritual magic or occultism, but you can't get around them, that concept completely when talking about this subject. So I figured I needed to include those magicians and witches, whoever it was that leaned back on that Hermeticism and alchemy convergence. Agrippa, Henry Cornelius Agrippa, wrote the 3 books on occult philosophy, 1531. Those books are still the basis of almost all high magical systems in some way or another. Paracelsus, German alchemist, not a very liked guy, came up with the concept of the tria prima. The tria prima are the 3 domains: the physical body, the mental self, and the spiritual self. In alchemy, they were salt, sulfur, and mercury, respectively. But after we get past this stuff, John Dee is an incredible story that I wish I could tell you guys. But if you want to research it before the 3rd class is over, I'm going to provide a couple of links to a documentary and some easy reading that could tell you that story in a pretty accurate way. It's not always told accurately, but John Dee was the alchemist to Queen Elizabeth I. He was a little bit of a weird guy, I would have to say, but he everyone believed that this guy had the ability to, he was a wizard. And the reason that he needs to be included is because every image that we see today of wizards like Merlin or Dumbledore or whatever, it came from him. He may not look exactly like them, but that's where those concepts came from. All of those fairy tale legends with wizards, he was the wizard that everyone knew who wrote those things. So it's very likely that it was him that they had in mind when they wrote those. Edward Kelly, that's a strange bird there. He has to go with John Dee because he and Dee met up at some point during the late part of the Middle Ages and went on a quest. They traveled to Prague, and Elizabeth I, her idea was that she wanted to have an alchemical kingdom. She felt like she was above the beliefs and practices of the average people, and felt she was more intelligent than that and wanted to think for herself. And so the alchemists and sages and philosophers gathered around her because they were safe there. So she wanted a magical sort of pagan kingdom, and Edward Kelly teamed up with John Dee to go pave that way, but they got kind of sidetracked, and it's a very funny story. The kingdom never kind of shook out that way, but that story is it's a whopper. Here we get into we're almost getting to the 1600s, where they're going to lay off the real persecution of alchemy. So it was able to survive right through that really 100 years of some difficulty. It wasn't over, but they made it through some of the toughest times. But the Hermetic tradition was still humming sort of under the radar thing. It was very, it became a hermetic. That's why we have the term hermetically sealed, or if you don't come in public, out in public, you're a hermit. You stay indoors all the time and you don't come out, you're a hermit. And if you can't get into a container, it's hermetically sealed, right? So that's where those terms come from, Hermeticism, because the hermit was known as someone you didn't get to see him very much, and for good reason. Isaac Newton was mostly responsible for the English translation of the corpus, so he's significant. And it really, when you look at people like him, sort of Renaissance men that you had popping up in the late early 1600s, you see a lot of that. Like Leonardo da Vinci, he was an artist of grand scale, but he also made navigation devices and also measuring devices. And the artist of the day was more than just a painter or a sculptor. You can see that in the sculptor. You can see that sculptor was not just a sculptor. This was someone of incredible ambition and fortitude. Here's Giordano Bruno. He is a saint now, with a statue in Vatican City. He's a Franciscan monk who was burned at the stake for alchemy during his time. This book here by Frances Yates, Dame Frances Yates, she's an enigmatic writer. It's a strange book, kind of, but the story it tells is accurate, and it's if you wanted to learn more about Bruno, I would say pick up Yates's book. Okay, now this is where it gets fun for me, because now we're having the emergence of the great magicians. The moment I was all waiting for. In the 1700s, early 1700s, you had Samuel Richter form the Order of the Golden Dawn, and not long after the Rosy Cross. So the Rosicrucians and the Golden Dawn were starting to take root, to make a run at it as a secret society, a sacred society. The Illuminati, Adam Weishaupt, Francis Barrett, the book Magus. I have slides for them, so I'm going to show you that. But this is where things start to really get interesting in this blending of Hermeticism, Eastern mysticism, and alchemy. The terms start to converge here in a big way, and the works start to make a lot more sense. Francis Barrett was the first to translate the Agrippa's 3 books on occult philosophy that I mentioned just a little while ago. So it was 100 years later, and Agrippa's books were thought to be very powerful probably the most technical, magical texts available. So if you wanted to get anywhere with magic, you wanted that information, and it hadn't been translated. So when Barrett translated those books into this Magus, the Celestial Intelligencer, it blew up and like crazy. It took the literary world by storm. It became a star overnight, and the book still sells like hotcakes today. It's a compendium that includes Agrippa's 3 books, and it also brings the ideas of Hermeticism, the elements, and the whole idea of this prima materia and this advancing consciousness, along with the purification or rarefication of high qualities that you see in Hebrew Kabbalah and all the mystic practices of the East, highly geared towards the mental process as vehicle for the spiritual. Eliphas Levi he's usually presented as the first Western occultist of that era of the greats. At this time in history, what was going on was really remarkable. You had the emergence of this new sort of wave of people that were not afraid to experiment and find out what this stuff was all. They were pulling up these texts and they were like, somebody put a lot of work into this, and this has nothing to do with any of that nonsense that was happening when people were getting killed over it. And so a lot of the high intellectually minded people of the West began to uncover the mystical texts, have them translated, and publish them. Eliphas Levi, Alphonse Louis Constant, was one of the masters. His transcendental magic was a breakthrough because he was a French guy, but it was suddenly something that people could grasp. They suddenly said, well, this isn't strange at all. All the Eastern mysticism they had seen was snake charmers and sort of taboo. This didn't look so strange. The symbolism did, but they were willing to listen. This figure here in the image inset is Levi's rendition of the sabbatic goat, Baphomet, goat of Mendes. This is a symbol that was existent in alchemy at the time. It was a hermaphroditic goat. You'll see hermaphroditic beings in alchemical art all the time, because in alchemy, everything is equally both things. They're equally male, female, and gender, equally positive and negative. All of the things that define our frequencies. And so the idea of the hermaphroditic entity is a representation of the alchemical process. The goat in question has the caduceus right in front of his heart, so it's a significant thing. Adam Weishaupt was the organizer and founder of the Bavarian Illuminati. Everybody has their conspiracy theories about this, and I don't know that it's a conspiracy, but it does fall in line with what the conspiracy theorists talk about, which is the irony of it, because you can see why it would be easy to think that this underground organization was out to take over the world if you were a conspiracy theorist, because this is a time when the European Enlightenment was happening, and suddenly there were a ton of really intelligent people that were trying to rewrite the way people understood things in history and literature and science wholesale. They were changing philosophy, they were changing science, and the sciences didn't exist before then in any real form that we could think of today. So as the Enlightenment was pressing forward, you had sciences like psychology and chemistry developing, medical sciences becoming organized and becoming foundational. So Weishaupt happened to be like the smartest person of the entire Enlightenment, and you will never hear this in any history lesson, but it's a fact. I mean, and you can only find that out if you research the people around him and the things that people were thinking and saying of him. This was an incredibly highly intellectually gifted person. He became the ultimate snob and had some serious financing behind him. And he moved to Bavaria. And from that location, the Bavarian Illuminati was formed, and the celebration happened in 1776, coincidentally the same year of the American independence. So it was a big celebration all over the place. And Weishaupt quite rapidly took over the spiritual sort of aspect of every Masonic lodge within his reach. So it spread very quickly, but it fell out of favor pretty quickly too. It was a threat to a lot of people for no good reason, but you know how people feel when somebody thinks they're smarter. And here's a couple of my favorites that I have slides for them. MacGregor Mathers, Crowley, Carl Jung, Rasputin, even what a character, and Abraham Maslow. And you might think, hell, do they have? What does Maslow have to do with it? Every bit of a lot of philosophical and sort of foundational concepts that Maslow employed and later developed into the hierarchy of needs and so forth came from those same principles of that you find in alchemy. There's that creepy Grigory Rasputin. His story is another one I would love to tell you, but if I told you that, we'd have to go to sleep tonight and start again. Suffice it to say, he was a crazy character in history. Both of these two are Russians, and I have a ton of respect for Helena Blavatsky. She went against all odds. It was easy to get killed in Russia back then for anything having to do with an unseen thing that was going on. You know, we have that same impression of them today, but it was very bad then. For her contribution, she was recognized as a mystic and that could actually tell the future or could see remotely. And she was later in life sort of exposed as a heretic, or charlatan, I should say, because people kind of had been working for a long time to catch her in a lie or catch her trying to, you know, embellish so that they could nail her, because that was her living. So towards the end of her life, she got old. She was not quite as slick, and she kind of fell out of favor with the bourgeoisie aristocrats because they felt like they had exposed her in some way. I don't think there's anything that can be said about her other than the fact that her Theosophical Society, formed way back then, is going strong today and has an area. So Blavatsky was a giant. These two right here are mega giants. You have Samuel MacGregor Mathers on the left and Aleister Crowley on the right. These two are responsible for most of what we know about high magic, they call it, about the ultimate expression of this amalgam of thought that came pouring in during the time that they lived. If you think about this period of time, it's from the late 1800s to just after World War II, and you think about the absolutely just gigantic people that were alive at that time, Winston Churchill, FDR, it's just mind-boggling to think. Einstein, it goes on and on. All you have to do is just think for a second, and someone will come to your mind that was, that's considered the representative of, they've become the archetype of their science or their literature or whatever it was. And if that's could be said about anybody in contemporary occult literature, it would be these two gentlemen here. MacGregor Mathers formed what's still the acting body of the Golden Dawn. When Crowley and he met, they actually made a deal to become the sort of spiritual side of Freemasonry that's concerned with secret magical ceremonies and rites. They're doing the magic that those two installed in those institutions. Carl Jung He's a Swiss psychiatrist and truly a visionary. Anything that you see emerging that are humanistic, spiritual, expansive, open and exploratory, that's due to this guy. If he wouldn't have been there and done what he did in breaking away from Freud, we might all know psychiatry and psychology as Freud's world, and that would be a horrible nightmare. Jung's ideas, way back when he broke from Freud, who was his mentor essentially, were that the subconscious mind if it contained the nightmares that Freud suggested, then it must also contain the activity and all the other things that come from us that we don't initiate. So Jung was a really important figure when it comes to the whole thing. And he's in the story of alchemy because at 55, he had already written all of his major works. Everything that we read from Jung right now in the classroom as in undergraduate school or graduate school, if you're looking to become a psychiatrist or a psychologist, you're going to be exposed to Jung. And at 55, he was still not satisfied because his idea of archetypes and symbolic meaning as critical vehicles for psychological exploration was unfulfilled still. And what he did finally discover was alchemy, and to try to update his existing work with some extra archetypal imagery. So kudos to him for recognizing it and being willing to step out there and say it. I'm going to try to show you guys a little clip at some.
For something in between, you know, something that linked that remote past with the present moment. And I found, to my amazement, it is alchemy.
So all the later works that Jung produced were based around the imagery and ideas in alchemy. Even the alchemical process, which is for another group, for another class, but that's a real interesting thing, and that's when we get into some of the useful things that we can do with it. This guy right here happens to be a hero of mine. He was a 33rd degree Scottish Rite Freemason, but he was also the most prolific esoteric writer and speaker in the history of the world. He was to the esoteric what Socrates was to the Socratic philosophy theory. He's recorded over 8,000 two-hour lectures on these topics. He did these lectures twice a week for the entirety of his life. There's a museum of books that looks like a library, but it's a museum in Los Angeles called the Manly P. Hall Philosophical Library. Published one work that a lot of you might be familiar with called The Secret Teachings of All Ages. And it was the first totally comprehensive of every spiritual tradition known to the modern world. He had a knack for understanding and being able to put into words some of these complex ideas and concepts, and even the symbols. If you don't have Secret Teachings, go out and get it. Or I'm going to provide you guys a link to that. There is an online one. The best one online is actually at the CIA library. Right, so our government does maybe know something. Something's important because the Secret Teachings of All Ages is there and it's being served from that library. But you can get downloads of PDF too. It is a kind of a big book, but it's an amazing thing to have. It's a coffee table book from hell. You can literally find something about anything that's considered belief, spiritual, philosophical, religious, and even fringe science. The guy was a storehouse of just fascinating information. Timothy Leary. He wasn't in the plans or anything, but he made his way onto the presentation because of how remarkable he was, number one, but also because he was a very advanced psychiatrist. He was the head of the department at Harvard. And then when things got dicey for him there because of his experiments with LSD on students, he moved to Berkeley, California, and became the head of the department at Berkeley. And those happen to be the two top schools in the world. So anybody who thinks he was a quack or, crapped out on his career or something just doesn't know Leary. This guy discovered something that he knew had the potential to change the world, and it happened to do with a deep understanding of brain chemistry and the effects of psychoactive substances of that sort on the human mind, and the ability for it to cause awakenings and to dampen and deaden the ego to a degree that he felt, and so did many others, would potentially end war and violence. So his cause was just, and his method, I have no problem with it. Somebody had to walk those paths at that time for us, and nobody could have done it with more class than him. He actually lived his whole life out and never sold out, and broadcast his death on YouTube. You can watch that too, and it's not just his death, it's the weeks and couple of months leading up to it, and to see how much of an alchemical life he lived. He had a system, and the system worked for him, and he decided that he was not going to die in a sad way as a tragedy, that he was going to go out celebrating it, his chance to go and experience what everyone's been speculating about their entire lives. And I believe he may have done it, but if you watch it, you can see how incredibly organized and just meticulous this guy was about everything physical, mental, and spiritual. He was just a really together person as far as that goes. So I consider him an alchemist of the highest order. And he always said he was continuing the work of Aleister Crowley. So yeah, I respect him for that. Here, Alan Watts, he's an English author and lecturer. He passed away now, 73, but his work lives on. Alan Watts is one of the most entertaining philosophers to watch and listen to. There are hours and hours of video footage on YouTube available of Watts and Terence McKenna, the other one in this picture. These two guys, to me, they're heroes. They're also giants. Like, that's a good word for a lot of these people, is giants, because everyone who came before or since is just not quite as big as them. So when I say giant, that's what I mean. I mean, hey, there's a lot of good, very intelligent, capable people that have said or tried to do what they've done, but there's only so many giants. And Alan Watts and Terence McKenna were giants. Watts was a professor for a short time, but he didn't need it. He sort of intellectualized himself right out of academia and just settled into talking on camera for huge sums of money and going and doing lectures in person at these select locations throughout the Western United States, sometimes Europe. Look at the other side without judgment and realize that we may be all wrong, and that's the great thing about his philosophy. He always, as much as he sounds like an elitist and like he's above people for what he does, he always ends a statement of matter of factness by saying, but then again, I could be full of shit. So, I really love that guy, and he was an alchemist in the truest sense. With his lifestyle, how he raised his kids, and what he spoke about. He spoke about these same ideas, the mind, body, spirit connection, which is really at the core of why you're here. That has been at the core of my own philosophy for ever since I can remember. And I found an expression for it. And part of that expression included this incredible, really beautiful world of alchemy. Terence McKenna was another alchemist in the sense that he was an explorer of the chemical mind as well. He discovered psilocybin mushrooms when he was just about to graduate from college. He's a highly educated guy, one of the smartest people that's ever lived also. These are two of the smartest guys that literally have ever lived. And you'll see that if you ever watch some of their stuff. But McKenna in particular had one of those ego death experiences in the Amazon when he traveled there to look for psychoactive plants. He basically spent his postdoctoral year or two, and then extended that into the rest of his life, traveling the world, experimenting with shamanic cultures, jungle cultures, and psychoactive plants. His main thing, though, was the mushroom. If you ever see any kind of pop culture involving the mushroom, there's a good chance that that image probably had something to do with Terence McKenna. God rest both of these guys. They were incredible. Something, maybe. Well, now they've put our numbers in the tens of millions, and it's going up. So, this is someone, Doreen Valentine, and this lady, I mean, her books were not necessarily something that I flocked to or anything, but when you realize what she contributed, dating all the way back to the earliest times when this stuff was coming out, in the 50s, basically, after the war, after the kings of the occult revival had passed away, their literature was avid. It was everywhere, and you had this sort of earth belief wanting to emerge from the ancient roots of the ancestors in Europe. You had the Germanic, Celtic, Saxon thread, Druids. Modern day really started to happen mid 50s when Gerald Gardner published his book. But Wicca, as you guys have probably already know, became a religion in our lifetimes. So Valiente was something else. She's got 20 books, so her literary contributions are giant too. Dolores Ashcroft Nowicki, one of my favorite authors in the esoteric and occult literature. She has over 20 books. They're all successful, and they're all about something slightly different. So the wellspring of information and really philosophical balance that this woman provided to our community is nothing short of just mind-boggling. I just put 4 books here to give you an idea of how broad her talent was. She could write about a compendium of history on one, and then next thing you know, she's writing about the Hebrew Kabbalah, or this middle pillar idea, pyramids, or it was a manual on how to do it. Like, she was just amazing. So I wanted to include her too. She was one of the first in the line to identify the magic that was emerging in the 60s, really, with alchemy. And to me, this is the ultimate alchemist. If we're going to talk about where does alchemy, for the actual material alchemy, have a representation in anything that would make any sense to us, we know that you can't turn lead into metal, right? I mean, lead into gold, right? Or base metals of any kind into gold. That's not exactly true. They are doing it at the Hadron Super Collider in Switzerland, but it's very costly. It costs more than the gold they make. This guy right here actually was the first one to technically succeed in the alchemical process. He is a Swiss scientist who actually lived pretty far into our era, and he isolated the chemical composition of lysergic acid dilithiumide, LSD, and was the first alchemist to actually rarefy a chemical known to be found in the human brain synthetically. He sat on that. He knew what it was. It was a deliberate thing, and he's a historic person now, because at the time we didn't know that or we didn't yet know that, we knew there was chemicals in the brain, but we didn't know necessarily that those same chemicals existed in plants per se, or could be synthesized like chemically in a laboratory back then. They didn't put two and two together that, you know, what they call opioid receptors in the brain now existed in a plant. The reason that we have what's called opioid receptors or cannabinoids as neurotransmitters are because they found it in the plant first, and then saw the reaction, did an analysis, and isolated it that way. But Albert Hofmann found this substance by way of his just genius and guile. 5 years later, he was at his laboratory still trying to see what he was going to do with it. And he says he accidentally ingested 500 micrograms of it. He said it soaked through his skin and whatnot. But they call that day, April 14th, 1943, Bicycle Day. And a lot of people don't know that April 14th, Bicycle Day. But I will tell you why it is, because he hadn't been heard from for a little while, and a girl that knew him and a friend of his went to his lab, and the door was locked, but they knew he was in there. So they were beating on the door and screaming and everything, and they heard something going on. So the guy kicked in the door finally, thinking that he was in trouble. And they found him lying flat on his back, riding an invisible bicycle, talking about being on his way home. So that's the day of the bicycle, and Bicycle Day. And Albert Hofmann is an incredible story. He, not long after that, once the world found out what it was, you know, Mr. Timothy Leary and the rest, he himself, you know, he didn't tune in, turn on, and drop out like Leary was saying to do, but he kind of did. He backed sort of away from science a little, and he didn't want to get in trouble for like anybody else did. He said he did his thing. So he kept doing science on his own, but he spent the rest of his life, he lived to 102. He spent the rest of his life actively speaking out against war, violence, and making the same argument that Leary and others were making, that he thought that there was a potential that this chemical could end war. I grabbed this meme and I put it on here just because I couldn't find the quote anywhere else, and I thought the picture was pretty poignant. He, you know, you saw what a refined guy he was, and we know how brilliant he was. But yeah, he discovered something in that experience, that an alchemical transformation that was cause enough to make him spend the rest of his life soul searching and wanting to connect with people and promote love instead of what he saw was a corrupt idea of human existence. So, all right, we're gonna finish with that little history lesson. I hope everybody enjoyed that. I hope everybody's still here. I couldn't see you guys with that on, but I wanted you to get the big pictures of it. I just wanted to bring it to today, you know, by giving a story that didn't break. So what did you guys think of that? You can turn your mics on if you want. I'd like to know what you thought of the, was there anything along the way of that story, that timeline, that was surprising to you, or was most of it something that you pretty much knew about, and it may be a different way?
A lot of it I didn't know, but not surprising.
I think you know, when I just was designing this workshop, the only thing I could think was all this history. I'm gonna be careful, but I hoped that I could get through it quick enough without rushing, that it would be something fun to watch, and it will be more meaningful as we move into the other material as well. So I hope you guys enjoyed that.
So John, where was the comment about the aliens?
The aliens, man. See, I would have included the aliens because I wanted to include, you know, some of my favorite authors, actually, Eric von Daniken and the sort. But but they weren't necessarily alchemists, and if I go on a rabbit trail like that, this will never get done. That's really the problem with this topic, is that it's too good of a topic. You know, you could literally talk about it, you know, for the rest of your life if you wanted to. And it really is a sort of a fairy tale in real life type of thing. So I hope that was an interesting thing for you.
I really appreciated the timeline. I got lost, you know, in time when you were going through the timeline, which it was kind of a cool experience, you know. So I appreciated that gorgeous timeline we did on everybody. That was really interesting. Thank you.
I wanted to tell it like a story instead of, you know, and so that was the plan, you know. Diane, what did you say?
Oh, I was just going to say that a lot of it was review for me, but there were some people I had not ever heard of. It was nice to hear about some more female wizards, if you will, other than Madame Blavatsky.
Yeah, that's usually all you get in the literature, you know. It says it was her, then she sort of faded it, you know, and died, and then it was, you know, all these guys. And, you know, that's something that that happens with the alchemy too. With alchemy, by the way, if you guys ask a question or something, just hit your mic off back again so we don't get any echo. You know, the misconception is that the alchemists were only men, and they were these sort of, you know, hidden guys that were, you know, above everyone in their minds, and sort of elitist, and were, you know, diabolical in their intention, and that it was only men and there was no women. That's not the case. But with women, it is the case that there were far fewer that were alchemists per se. The women that were the alchemists were hidden because they tend to be smarter and more wily. You know, women are usually much smarter than men when it comes to things like that. The men want to show their ass, and the women do their work because they don't care about showing their ass. So at the same time that, you know, the alchemical sort of lineage was trying to make gold, you had some incredibly gifted spiritual women all over the place. But they were, if they thought better of it, they would kind of keep that to themselves, because, you know, as you all know, throughout that time in history, women didn't have much of a say in things. You know, they didn't even get the right to vote until well into the United States history. So to think that, you know, they're going to come out with some of this, you know, incredibly intellectual and developed stuff, that would be a far-fetched thing. Not that they didn't have it, they did, just like the shamans did. This is a thread of knowledge that goes much further than any book or any form of symbolism or any culture even. This is a thread of truth that speaks to an undercurrent that some call the Akashic record, some call it Gaia consciousness, some call it you know, the tarot speaking to them, or astrology when they assess the alignment of planets and the energies of those planets. It's an awareness of these trajectories in our lives and in our worlds that have a magnetism and a push and pull going on with them, with their energies. Women are much more sensitive to that. So that's why at the end of the close of that era, you had a lot of what we know about with the witch burnings, and, you know, even here in America it happened with the Salem witch trial. That was the tail end of that mess, but women were catching it at that time because the men had already sort of locked away their tools and learned how to sort of be, you know, discreet, you know, but the women were trying to break out and show their ability, and they weren't rewarded very kindly for that. So you know, I wanted to I knew that those topics are going to come up, and they always do when you talk about the esoteric. You're always going to have thoughts and ideas about periods in time where one belief was at war with another, or, you know, trying to commit a genocide against another. This is what we do in human history. If you go back to the very early days of the era of conquerors, before the world was divided up yet. You know, everybody was still battling for a chunk. You know, the Persian Empire grew into this gigantic thing and broke up, and it grew bigger and then broken up. You know, Greece, they thought it would last forever. It didn't. But it took almost 500 years for it to decline. You know, it was at least 200 when the decline was evident, before it finally was something else. But when the world was being divided up among our distant archaic ancestors, the ideas that they carried with them during these conflicts were fought over for all the wrong reasons, because none of them were willing to admit or they didn't see. I'll give them the benefit of the doubt. Some of them didn't see it. Was that they were all saying the same thing. The core of what they were saying was the same thing. They were arguing over someone's name against someone else's name, so one symbol against another. You know, the archetypes have always been there. It's how do you connect with them? All right. The Hellenistic period, the pantheon of Greek gods. Listen, I don't think there's ever been a culture more intellectually advanced in their approach, at least. Yeah, they had their blinders on in a lot of areas, but to think that culture didn't understand that the pantheon of gods was a archetypal structure. They actually thought Zeus was throwing lightning at them. That's crazy talk. They did not. They think of it as mythology just like we do. They were just very serious about it. They were very serious. If they felt a god or a goddess, you know, pulling or pushing on them, you know, they needed to react to it. They would do whatever it took to pacify that situation, because whether the god existed or not, let's face it, they were going to suffer, right? So what did it matter if the god existed or not? It really didn't. You know, and it's similar to religion and spiritual philosophies nowadays. Whether the stories that we read and the doctrines that we learn are true stories per se, or that of actual events that happened and verifiable, doesn't really matter. It doesn't really matter. You know, what really matters is if it means something to you. If it helps you, I don't care if you worship a shoe. You know, if you have a, you know, it doesn't really matter what it is. It's the bottom line is what's going to get the job done, and that's really what this entire thing is about. So I think that what we just brought together is an important step towards getting into the actual details. I'm going to go ahead and take a break, guys, because it's break time at least, right? I don't even know. I don't look at clocks very much. It's the next step for us is going to be a fun one. Let me pull it up so I can tell you exactly what it is, and we'll go ahead and close here soon, because I know if there's anybody who scheduled this and is going to need to end, I don't want to, you know what I mean, be holding someone up. But I wanted to give you guys an idea of what I'm going to talk about next time, and it's not just going to be me talking either. We're going to get engaged in some really interesting stuff. Okay, so the next workshop is called Living a Magical Life, and it is beginning to see how these ideas, thought, and developing threads of understanding can actually be sort of scaffolded into our structures in our modern life. We're going to talk about the 7 steps to the alchemical operation, and that's at the core of spiritual alchemy. It's a sort of problem solving and day-to-day concept that's very interesting, and I'm sure you'll find it fascinating and fun. And we're going to talk about cosmic influences. So that's going to be an interesting one, and I'd like to do that. So thing, maybe third eye a little bit, but it's going to be around the concept of the principles of sort of the physics of being human, and it's how these chemical processes actually become a spiritual pursuit. I hope everybody can make it.
John, when's the day and time?
That's what I was going to say. If we can decide, are all you guys okay with the same day and time?
I think it might be.
Well, as long as Carol can still grill us.
Yeah, I mean,
as long as the entertainment comes along with it.
Right. If everyone's in agreement,
I got 3-day weekend, so.
Yeah, if everybody's in agreement, we'll just do next Sunday, same time. Good?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay.
Sure.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Awesome. I've got it broken into 2 pieces. We'll take a break in the middle. It'll be great. All right? Thank you
Good
guys.
job, everyone.
Good
Good
job.
job.
Love you all. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.
Good seeing you all. Have a